Pro-migrant supporters clashed with anti-migrant protesters following a court order in which a hotel in a London suburb will have to evict asylum seekers.
At 9:17 p.m. last night, the British social contract didn't just break, it ignited. While the mainstream media tries to label what is happening in 15 simultaneous cities as isolated unrest, the smoke rising over Tamworth tells a different story. It is the story of a government that has lost control and a prime minister who is choosing to manage the decline rather than serve his people. Last year, 111,000 asylum claims were lodged, the highest in our history. Today, £8 million of your tax money is being spent every 24 hours to house arrivals in 210 hotels across the country. The warning signs were flashing red from Epping to West London, yet the Home Office ignored their own internal memos. Tonight, we expose the data they tried to censor and the reality of a nation at its breaking point. Let's look at the numbers that Whitehall is desperate to hide. Since this uprising began, over 1,800 British citizens have been detained, many arrested simply for being present or shouting in their own streets. Now, look at the other side of the ledger. In that same time frame, how many illegal arrivals, people who broke the law to enter, have been removed? Less than 300. That is 1,800 taxpayers in cells versus 300 deportations. This isn't an administrative error, it is the blueprint of a two-tier justice system. While pensioners are told they must freeze this winter because there is no money, the government continues to fund a hotel strategy that their own civil servants warned would destabilise communities. They aren't trying to stop the boats, they are trying to normalise them, scouting your town halls and military bases for the next new model of... Why the censorship? Why the pressure on social media companies to delete footage of your own streets? Because Keir Starmer knows that if a family in the south sees the reality of what is happening in the north, the narrative of social cohesion collapses. They are treating the British public not as citizens to be served, but as a population to be controlled. The fire in Tamworth was a warning. It was a symptom of a much deadlier disease, the total erasure of community consent. When you criminalise dissent, you make resistance the only language left. From harassment near schools to the tragic cases reported in Hounslow, the safety of your families has become a secondary concern to the requirements of international human rights courts. The battle for the soul of Britain has moved from the ballot box to the high street. The government thinks that by arresting enough people and banning enough accounts, the anger will vanish. They are wrong. You cannot fix a broken contract with a press release or a censorship campaign. To the viewers who stayed, you are the only variable left in this equation. The media, the politicians, and the police command have all picked their side. Now, you have to decide if you will wait until the coaches pull up in your town, or if you will demand that your country belongs to you. The days of polite silence are over. We will keep showing you the numbers they hide, because a country kept in the dark can never truly be free.
I will not yield, Britain will not yield on our principles and values about the future of Greenland under threats of tariffs.
Britain has walked straight into a geopolitical storm, a Greenland showdown that spun out of control, a UK-US trade deal hanging by a thread, and a domestic immigration system buckling under pressure. This is the story of a government trying to look unshakable while the world reorders itself around it, and of a Prime Minister discovering that strength declared in Parliament means nothing when events in Davos move faster than Westminster can catch up. It began with a sentence delivered in the Commons, a vow of defiance, a declaration that Britain would not yield to tariff threats over Greenland. For a moment, it sounded like the country had rediscovered its footing, but within the hour the ground shifted, and by nightfall the Arctic chessboard had been redrawn without the UK even in the room.
What's just happened in the last hour? Starmer and co. have yielded, yes, based upon a very productive meeting that I have had with the Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte. This is, of course, coming from President Trump's social media. We have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. As ever, Sir Keir Starmer is several steps behind. He's known as Never Hear Keir because he's always jetting off around the world. But this time, he decided to actually stay in Britain and not go to Davos. So he's missed out on being part of the Greenland chat.
Starmer's strong words ricocheted across TV screens, designed to show a Britain still capable of pushing back against an American president willing to weaponize tariffs. It was the Prime Minister's most forceful performance in months. Calm delivery, clean posture, the authority of a leader defending national principle. But outside that chamber, Davos was unfolding at a brutal pace. Trump, speaking with the confidence of a man who understands pressure better than diplomacy, announced that the United States and NATO leadership had already formed the framework of a deal on Greenland and the wider Arctic region, a framework built without the UK. A framework that instantly neutralized the tariff threat, but on Washington's terms, not London's. In an instant, Starmer's defiance lost its weight. Britain had spoken boldly while a different outcome was being negotiated thousands of miles away. And when the Danish Prime Minister arrived in London the next day, hoping perhaps to stand shoulder to shoulder with the UK, the deal had already been done elsewhere. No joint posture, no diplomatic win, no strategic role for Britain beyond applauding decisions made without it. Inside Whitehall, the mood shifted from frustration to disbelief. Senior officials whispered that the UK had become a spectator in its own alliance. The government insisted it had taken a principled stand, but the world had moved too quickly for principles alone. The Greenland crisis did not erupt into a vacuum. It collided with a domestic landscape already stretched to breaking point. Detention centres operating below capacity despite rising numbers of small boat arrivals. Protests flaring as asylum seekers challenged the Home Office's one-in, one-out policy. Councils overwhelmed by housing shortages, while public anger sharpens with every new headline. The Home Office's decision to introduce stricter English language rules for new arrivals has ignited another wave of controversy, accused by some of being a political smokescreen and by others of being overdue. But the deeper issue is perception, a government promising control while communities feel anything but secure. So when the Prime Minister thundered about defending Greenlandic sovereignty and Western principles, many asked a quieter, more uncomfortable question. Where is that resolve when Britain's own borders look porous? Where is that steel when towns along the coast are begging for support? It is no coincidence that immigration frustration and geopolitical anxiety are rising together. Both speak to a fear that Britain no longer commands the authority it once did, not abroad, not at home.
Amid the Greenland chaos sits a deeper and far more consequential problem, the future of the UK-US trade deal. For half a decade, successive governments have promised that a landmark trade agreement with Washington would anchor Britain's post-Brexit economy. Yet tonight, that dream looks increasingly like a political relic. Trump has already signalled that Britain is not meeting his expectations on defence, Arctic alignment or China policy. The approval of the controversial Chinese mega-embassy in London has raised eyebrows across the Atlantic, and Britain's absence from the Greenland framework discussions has amplified the perception that London is drifting, unsure of its footing, unable to act with decisive intent. Officials within the Department for Business, speaking quietly but urgently, warned that the trade deal is no longer a strategic inevitability, but a distant aspiration. America is negotiating with Europe, with NATO, with governments willing to align themselves with its Arctic agenda. What it has not shown is any eagerness to prioritise Britain, especially a Britain perceived as hesitant, reactive, and increasingly divided. What is rarely acknowledged publicly is just how much leverage Britain has already lost. US negotiators, according to senior trade analysts, now speak openly about seeking bilateral concessions that would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago, including stricter rules on data transfer, expanded agricultural access, and deeper defense procurement guarantees. These are not merely bargaining chips, they are signs the balance of power has shifted. Washington knows the UK needs a win, and it is pricing that desperation into every conversation. If Britain enters formal talks from this weakened position, it may not secure a deal at all, or worse, it may sign one that locks the country into structural dependence for years. Tariff uncertainty alone threatens billions in investment, and businesses already fatigued by years of instability are beginning to look elsewhere. The idea of global Britain, once a rallying cry, is becoming harder to defend.
The patterns emerging are impossible to ignore. A Prime Minister asserts sovereignty over Greenland, only to be overtaken by events orchestrated elsewhere. A government promises control of immigration, while its detention centres sit half-empty and unrest spreads. A country vows to forge bold new trade alliances, yet finds itself sidelined as global power blocs reshape Arctic strategy without it. In geopolitics, absence is not neutral, it is dangerous. Britain's decision not to attend Davos may have been intended to show focus at home, but it instead highlighted a reality the public is beginning to recognise. The world is no longer waiting for the UK. China expands influence inside London. The US negotiates Arctic security without British input. Europe braces for tariff retaliation and tightens its unity. And Britain stands in the crosswinds, arguing principle while partners and rivals alike race ahead with practical deals. What haunts Westminster tonight is a single fear, that Britain is no longer steering its future, but being dragged behind it. A Prime Minister declares strength. A president redraws the map, a trade deal wavers, an immigration system strains. A nation once certain of its place now finds itself unsettled, unanchored, unsure. If Britain cannot shape the world will shape Britain, and it is already happening faster than anyone in government is willing to admit. So the question facing the country tonight is stark, urgent, and unavoidable. How many more shocks can Britain withstand before the illusion of control finally collapses?
London is becoming a battleground for conflicts that were never Britain's to fight. A capital city pulled into the orbit of overseas wars. Lives put at risk not by British extremists, but by the long reach of foreign regimes. And the warning that now echoes through Westminster is brutally direct. British lives are in danger. That message came from Iranian protesters, who say they are fighting not only to free their own country, but to save the UK from an Islamist threat they believe is already operating on British soil. Their plea exploded into the public consciousness on a winter night in Kensington, the night Britain discovered that its streets were no longer neutral ground. It began with shouts, flashing lights, and a barricade pushed to its limit outside the Iranian embassy. Protesters gathered to challenge the Islamic Republic and to raise the flag their families are banned from flying at home. When a young man climbed the facade to replace the regime's emblem, police surged forward. What happened next still divides the city. Officers say they were provoked. Protesters say they were kettled without warning, crushed between metal barriers and the iron fence of Hyde Park. People scrambled up stone walls just to breathe. Elderly men were knocked down. Several were left with broken bones. 13 arrests turned into 14. And the emotion that swept through the crowd wasn't defiance, it was fear. But it didn't end at the barricades. Activists say police followed injured protesters to hospital, detained them in waiting rooms, and treated them as suspects rather than victims. To them, this wasn't policing, it was intimidation. And it looked, they said, uncomfortably similar to the regime tactics they fled. What turned this into a national alarm was not the clash itself, but what followed. Iranian dissidents now claim that Britain has allowed sympathizers of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to live, organize, and influence narratives inside the UK.
They argue that while protesters face kettling and batons, pro-regime networks move freely, shielded by charity status, diplomatic immunity, or political hesitation. And they warn that the inconsistency is not random, it is dangerous. Their message, repeated again and again outside Parliament, is stark. If Britain cannot protect the people who fled a regime, how can it protect itself from the regime's reach? And this warning arrives at a moment when the country is already strained. The Starmer government faces mounting pressure over protests, asylum policy, and the spread of foreign state influence. Counter-terror police are investigating targeted attacks on dissidents from other countries, and London is struggling to maintain order as overlapping geopolitical flashpoints spill onto its streets.
The Kensington clash is not an isolated eruption. It fits into a bigger fracture line running through Britain today. Crowds shutting down central London week after week, communities divided over asylum centres, violent incidents linked to overseas political movements, and the constant accusation that policing standards shift depending on who is marching. London has always been an international city, but now activists say it is becoming something darker, a staging ground, a place where foreign governments test influence, where rival exiles confront each other, where domestic policing is caught between public safety and international pressures. For Iranians who fled Tehran's dictatorship, the fear is personal. They say their families back home are interrogated whenever they speak out in the UK. They say they receive threats even in London cafes. And they warn that if Britain underestimates this threat, it will be repeating the same mistake that allowed the regime to grow powerful in the first place.
As the steel barriers are cleared from Kensington and the bruises fade from protesters' faces, the larger crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Because if London is now hosting the battles of other nations, if foreign regimes can intimidate British residents on British soil, and if the police response changes depending on the politics of the protest, then the question becomes unavoidable. Is Britain still in control of its own streets, or has the front line quietly moved to London without anyone admitting it?